So, hi, Kathy and Amy. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had some great questions come in from our supporters who are really excited to learn more about you and the work you're currently doing to better protect aquatic animals. So, before we get started, I just wondered if you could both tell us a little bit about yourself. Kathy, is it okay to start with you?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for inviting us. We're delighted to be here. I'm Kathy. I'm a professor at Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon, where I direct the Animal Law Clinic and the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative. And I helped found and develop the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark. I write and speak generally on animal law and animal legal education issues, and I've developed a particular focus on aquatic animals. I've been working in the field for over 30 years, and I'm lucky enough to be the first law professor hired to teach animal law full-time anywhere in the world. So I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's amazing. Thanks, Kathy. And Amy?
Hi, thank you for having us as well. I'm Amy. I am the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative Fellow and assist with the Animal Law Clinic at Lewis and Clark Law School. I focus on the regulation of and legal protection for aquatic animals. I'm also the co-founder and director of Animal Law Reform South Africa, which is the first animal law nonprofit in the country.
Amazing. Brilliant. Thanks so much, both of you. And yeah, as I mentioned, we've had a number of questions come in. And the first one actually is for both of you. So first of all, why did you each decide to focus your work on the legal protection of aquatic animals? And Amy, if we can maybe start with you.
Sure. Well, I guess I've always loved the water and the ocean. Growing up, my father actually had a marine fish tank, and I used to sit for hours and hours and watch all of the animals. I was absolutely fascinated by and loved all of them and named them. And at a young age, I stopped eating fish and aquatic animal products. So I believe that it's really important to protect aquatic animals because they are our fellow earthlings, they're worthy of our respect. They are valuable not only because they quite literally keep us alive, but they have intrinsic value as individuals. And this is obviously why the work of ALLA is so important, because we aim to highlight the plight of aquatic animals, elevate their status in our society, and ensure that their interests are accounted for within the legal system.
Amazing. Thanks so much. And Kathy?
Yeah, thank you. I've come to my work with aquatic animals in maybe a less direct way than some other folks. I started working in the animal protection movement as a result of my work in nonviolence and through that lens. And my view had been that we need to pay attention to all victims of violence, and we need to reduce violence no matter who it affects or where it occurs. And it led me to look for the hidden victims of violence and also for the victims for whom other people weren't already working and engaged to help them. And so that led me to animals more generally. And I think that also one of the things I've learned in my work with animals is that focus has really helped us. So in the movement. So when we decided to focus on the different contexts in which animals are used and abused, we learn a lot more. So factory farming is just one example. It allowed us to ask questions, learn about industrial uses, choices, practices. And that meant that we were able to learn things that we didn't even know to ask about, because we hadn't even conceived of some of the practices that were occurring. So when you go and you look at something really critically, you learn an awful lot more. And so we spent, I think, in the animal protection movement, some time looking at animals in farming, in research, in those kinds of contexts. And in doing that work, I began to notice the absence of conversation about aquatic animals across all of those spectrums. And so decided that I needed to look for that information, found that it wasn't there, and then decided we needed to start developing that information, gathering that information, asking those questions, and broadening that conversation within the movement. And so we see that animals are treated differently across those different contexts. And in particular, I think looking at aquatic animals helps us understand how important it is to see animals as biological beings and to see that connected to their treatment. And so we began to ask those kinds of questions, wondered what we could do about it, and realized that there was need for really specific attention, again, focus on aquatic animals as a group across all those spectrums of use. And so that's part of why we decided to do that. We also, as Amy suggested, you can't protect what you don't know, what you don't see. And if you don't see harm, we tend to default to thinking it's not occurring. So once you go look, and once you realize it's happening, and once you understand the biology of these animals, you're driven to want to protect them. And so that's the work that we've been heavily engaged in lately.
Amazing, that's great. I think, as you say, there's just been such a gap in this area over the years, and which kind of obviously relates to why the legal protections are kind of failing aquatic animals so much now. So yeah, so grateful you're both focusing your work in this area. And so our next question focuses on aquaculture specifically, so farmed aquatic animals. And Amy, this one's for you. So what are the major welfare concerns associated with aquaculture, so raising aquatic animals for consumption, and which aquatic animals are farmed for their flesh most throughout the world?
Great. Well, there are a large number of welfare concerns and issues associated with aquaculture. And many of these are similar to those that we would see with terrestrial animals that are used in farming, although there are some unique and additional ones. So I'm just going to do it in a nutshell. These include things such as the intensive confinement of these animals, having many of them in a very small amount of space, what they refer to in the industry as the stocking density, issues around how these animals are killed or slaughtered. Many terrestrial animals are required to be stunned before they are killed to make it more humane, but there are not similar requirements for aquatic animals. Then issues such as what their food is made from, or their feed composition, the enrichment of their environment, the use of antibiotics and chemicals, because there are so many of them, things like diseases, parasites, and deformities. And then some of the less thought about issues such as the water quality, how they are transported, and then there's others. Really everything from the moment that they are born to how they are kept, and then how they ultimately killed. These all raise different welfare concerns. And all of these are only welfare, and it doesn't factor in all of the other relevant aspects, including like environmental impacts, health and safety, etc. Then the second part, in terms of the most farmed aquatic animals, this kind of differs from one jurisdiction to the next, and it also depends on the types of systems that are used. So there's freshwater systems and marine water systems, and there's a variety of factors that implicate this. But I would say among the most commonly farmed for finfish, you'd find salmons, catfishes, carps, and tilapias. For crustaceans, that would be shrimps and prawns. And then for mollusks, it would be things like oysters, clams, and mussels.
Amazing, thank you so much. And yeah, as you say, there's so much in this area, isn't there? So thanks so much for condensing it into a short video for us. Brilliant. And the next question we had kind of looks a bit more aquatic animal law. So Kathy, what are the most overlooked aquatic animals in terms of animal welfare legislation? And why do you think policymakers have failed to prioritise these species more?
It's a great question. And I think it goes back to what we've been saying in two parts, that if we don't see the animals, we don't know about them, and we don't know that they need protection. And if we don't understand their biology, we don't know how our activities are causing them harm. And so in general, the animals that we have seen in the aquatic realm are animals like whales and turtles. And those are animals we also, as societies, tend to want to protect the more charismatic creatures, right? So we have mythologized whales for centuries, for instance, and they are huge and majestic and sort of unknowable in some ways, but we can actually see them. But there are animals that we don't see. And so that not seeing and not knowing is at least one general response to why we're not doing more for them. But I think we don't also truly understand their biology. And when we say that, we mean, so for instance, when I was in school as a child, I was taught that fish don't feel pain. And that's just simply not true, right? It's not biologically true. The scientists now are saying that's not true. But we also were taught to treat and see these animals as dumb creatures, right? As creatures who behave by instinct and not by intentionality, that they couldn't form family bonds, they couldn't think, they couldn't make strategic choices, they couldn't cooperate, things like that. And so without knowing those kinds of things, we relegate them to to things rather than beings. And that makes it a lot harder for us to actually pay attention to their needs, and much, much easier for us to overlook them. And when you think about the drain on resources for legislators, it's really hard to say, hey, you should be paying attention, you should take time, you should put resources into this conversation. So I think some of the most overlooked categories are the ones that we either use economically, like factory farmed aquatic animals, for instance, the ones we want to use. So we're not really looking at how to protect them. That's an economic incentive to sort of ignore their needs, or the ones we literally don't even see or know about. And those are things that animals that we don't even think of in the aquatic category. So there are animals like bait fish or stocking fish that are so low down, if you will, on the value hierarchy that we're not talking about them, even in the animal community, as much as we should. There are animals like seabirds that we don't even think of as related to the aquatic ecosystem. Animals that are like anchovies that are so heavily used and so overfished, and used not just for food, but industrial uses, even the oil and so forth, that again, we're just not thinking about how to protect them. We're thinking more about how to exploit them. And so we have to sort of disentangle those things. So I think this insufficient knowledge about the animals themselves, and the insufficient knowledge about when we take them out of the ecosystem, the impacts that are much more broad, right? So as Amy suggested, we're not even talking about slavery in fishing. We're not talking about the environmental damage. We're not talking about consumer fraud. We're not talking about all kinds of other aspects. But even if you're just looking at the ecosystem in which we raise these animals, whether that's in the wild or in captivity, we don't understand how that all works and how one action has an effect, right, on these other aspects of the environment. So we have these vested economic interests, social interests, and they conflict, right, with our desire to have cheap food, to have business that's thriving, you know, all kinds of things. So I think there's an awful lot of reasons we could kind of go on, but in a nutshell, I think those are some of the most glaring ones.
Amazing, really interesting, thank you. And kind of going on from that, Amy, what legislation do you consider the most crucial to be put in place for aquatic animals?
Great, yeah, that's a big question. So I'm just going to kind of touch on a few of these. One of the biggest challenges is that aquatic animals are not actually included in the most basic of protections, even that we grant to terrestrial animals. So as a very first step, it would be to include them within these existing laws and protections, because they're not even included sometimes in the definition of animal within the legislation. So some anti-cruelty statutes just don't even include them within the very structure of the word animal. So some of the practices relating to them are also excluded. So things like farming of these animals are specifically excluded from that legislation. For farmed animals, it would be to start offering them at least the same basic minimum protections as terrestrial animals. So when it comes to keeping them, transportation and humane slaughtering, and then naturally some of the issues that I already mentioned need to be addressed. Prohibiting the use of cetaceans for entertainment and keeping them in captivity is a big one. Then I would say for wild animals, one of the most necessary developments is to expand marine protected areas. And then within the areas that already exist, to stop allowing for harmful practices such as fishing and other extractive and exploitative actions that are currently happening. Another key area would be to holistically provide for the protection of endangered and threatened species. So what we tend to do is focus on looking at the species that's facing extinction or that is threatened or vulnerable, but we don't look at things, for example, such as their food sources and protecting their food sources. So overfishing and other harmful impacts caused by fishing need to be properly regulated and enforced. Those are just a couple. So I could go on, but I think those are just some worth highlighting.
Amazing, thank you. And yeah, it's so much related to the work we're doing at Animal Equality to get aquatic animals as part of the WATOC, the Welfare at Time of Killing regulations, as a first step. So they're somewhere kind of getting along the same lines as land farmed animals as well. And thinking about kind of challenges and successes that you've had in your work so far, Amy, what are the biggest challenges you face when advocating for aquatic animals?
So I think Yeah, these definitely touched on a couple of these before. There's a huge number of different challenges that we face in advocating for aquatic animals. These largely relate to the incorrect beliefs and perceptions that societies, politicians, lawmakers, and others have, and this includes in relation to their capacities, everything from their sentience to their ability to feel pain to their intelligence. And these misconceptions lead people to believe that aquatic animals are less worthy of recognition or that they do not need protection from abuse or neglect. So that's obviously, as an initial start, a really big problem. One of the more practical challenges in our work is that it's very difficult to find accurate information about aquatic animals, their welfare, how many of them are used, and the impacts of these industries that use them, as Kathy mentioned. So this includes research, data, scientific information. And when that information does exist, it's often insufficient or incorrect or outdated. So for example, if we are trying to find the number of animals or aquatic animals that are used for food, it's very difficult because they are measured by the weight and they're measured by the tonnage. So we can't even get the correct number of individual animals that are impacted. And when the numbers do exist, they exclude a large number of issues such as bycatch and things like that. In addition to this challenge, I would say in trying to make meaningful change in law and policy, as Kathy mentioned, capacity constraints and huge other priority areas of work, right? So we're facing huge vested economic, cultural, and social interests when we're trying to advocate against these things, and we're conflicting with these things such as food security and industries like fishing. So those are just a couple of examples of some of the challenges that we face.
Kathy, what has been the biggest successes that you've seen for farmed aquatic animals in legislation?
So it's a great question. I wish I had a great answer. There's not a lot. And so let me sort of break my answer down into a couple of parts. So right now, what we see legislatively is that there's a lot more activity actually pushing the development of the factory farmed aquaculture industry, even over and as opposed to other industries, including farming terrestrial animals and wild caught fishing. People are saying this is a better industry to support. We need to, it has all kinds of potential benefits, which we might dispute. So there's a lot of work needed because the legislative effort is to increase the industry rather than to regulate it or to reduce it and constrain it sort of in any way. Having said that, again, before I talk more specifically about some successes, one of the things that we find helpful is to look at successes for aquatic animals in other contexts, because we can learn from those experiences, even if they're not all completely related. So we can look at the fact that there is some good legislation around the world around the responsibility of fishing nets. And sometimes that's really not to do with the welfare of animals, but the welfare of the ocean, which is okay as long as we're like making that better. That's a really good thing. And so the kinds of responsibility we see built into legislation are requiring fishing nets, for instance, to have excluders so that they are more likely designed to catch the kind of animals they're trying to catch and not have the bycatch, right? The catching of these other animals who are just killed and wasted. And also responsibility for fishing nets so that they're not just floating around in the oceans once they're dislodged or they become loose from the ships. So that's just one example. There are also restrictions on the use in captivity and breeding of aquatic animals for entertainment, for use in aquariums, those kinds of things. And there is sort of, as Amy was saying, alluding to the need for, there's some growing inclusion of aquatic animals in general law. So anti-cruelty statutes. Here in the US, we have sort of custody statutes that are beginning to talk about what happens to animals when people get divorced, companion animals. And in most of those, aquatic animals are included. So we're seeing the inclusion of aquatic animals. The more we have these conversations, it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about factory farmed animals or animals used in entertainment. Once we elevate the conversation more generally, that people understand aquatic animals have feelings, have needs, right, should be protected, that I think helps across the spectrum of legislative activity. So that's why I'm mentioning that. For farmed aquatic animals in particular, there have been some restrictions on ocean pen aquaculture here in the US. That's at the state level, not the federal level. There have been expansion of marine protected areas, as Amy suggested, and that's globally. People are beginning to do that, and that's both to protect the habitat and to exclude some of these exploitative uses within the zones, which is a really good thing. There have been some seafood labeling regulations, which aren't particularly welfare driven, but they are actually helpful in helping people understand exactly what's going on. And then not legislatively, but there are some guidelines coming from the OIE, the Welfare Code, coming from different organizations, the work that Animal Equality and other organizations are doing to say we should have some standards. And they may not make it into legislation, but they may inform legislative efforts, and that's very, very helpful. I'll also say that so we're working on a legislation here in Oregon for humane slaughter in aquaculture. And so we're a ways away from making that happen, but there are more efforts. So even though we don't have a lot of great successes to point to right at this moment, there are increasing efforts, and that makes us happy. The other thing that I'll mention is that there are gains outside of the legal context, and that also informs the legal context. And so it's useful to keep those in mind. And I would say the biggest success that we're seeing right now is in the development of alternatives. So alternative foods, alternative uses, even in research context, but food in particular is just burgeoning. It's just a growth field with all kinds of plant-based and cell-based and even fermentation-based. There's new technologies that people are using to get animal products out of industrial uses, which is a really, really fabulous thing. And so I think you'll see that growing more. And that again informs legislative efforts, because if there's a viable alternative, that makes it much harder to support the use of harmful activities. And so I think those two things go together very nicely and make us somewhat hopeful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the success of documentaries like Seaspiracy and My Octopus Teacher and things like that, again, and just getting people talking about it and just letting them know what goes on a little bit more. So it all helps, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yes.
Amazing. And we've kind of touched upon this a little bit already, but Amy, do you think people find it harder to empathise with aquatic animals, and why?
So most definitely, yes. People tend to empathise less with aquatic animals, or people tend to empathise with certain species, the charismatic ones, as Kathy mentioned, so whales and dolphins and turtles, right? Less likely to emphasize with fish, with crabs, with shrimps, reptiles, or even corals that are also animals, right? So one biological reason is that it's more difficult or sometimes impossible for people to notice or understand when they're experiencing pain. So they don't exhibit the same sort of traits that we're used to seeing or hearing. So the sound of screams or facial expressions that we'll see in mammals. That's one example. They're also out of sight, out of mind. They live in water bodies. We don't see them as much, and they are less prevalent and represented in our societies and day-to-day lives. And two kind of examples I wanted to highlight was, if you think of people who enjoy trophy fishing or sports fishing, they proudly display their pictures of them holding them up on social media, and this is totally normalized in society. But if you did the same thing for terrestrial animals, it's much more harshly criticized. And then if you think about something like trophy hunting, it's a very kind of good comparison in my mind. Another example is companion animals, so pet fish. They're often kept in tiny tanks their whole lives. And then when they die, people could flush them down the toilet, and then they simply replace those animals. So we wouldn't even consider doing something like that with a cat or a dog that we have as a companion animal. And I think that really highlights the kind of discrepancy of how people treat these animals and how they find it harder to empathize with them over other sorts of terrestrial animals and mammals in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, Kathy, what are the most threatened species of aquatic animals right now, would you say?
So sadly, there is a long-ish list, and I won't go through all of them. What I'll say is, for people who are interested in looking at endangered or threatened species, there are a number of places to look because the list continues to grow, sadly. So CITES, for people who don't know, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, has a list, and that's a global list. Each jurisdiction also has their own list. And when you have a large jurisdiction, for instance, like the United States, we have a federal list and then we have state lists. So because animals have different habitats. So that's just something to say as a background, that you can sort of be looking in a particular area if you're interested. There is information. So And the other thing that I want to highlight, something that Amy and I find the need to mention a lot, is that we focus an awful lot on marine species, but when we talk about aquatic animals, we're talking about freshwater species as well. And so looking at all those species, so corals all over the world are heavily endangered. And as Amy said, most people don't realize corals are animals. They think of corals as a reef, a rock, right, as sort of inanimate object, but corals are made up of lots and lots of species. And so corals are in significant danger. Whale sharks, hawksbill sea turtle, Kemp's Ridley sea turtle, sea otters, river otters, blue whales, river dolphins around the world, including vaquitas, which we can talk about more if you're interested, the Florida manatee, the Galapagos penguin, the Hawaiian monk seal, bluefin tuna, Chinese paddlefish, Mekong catfish. So there's a really, really long list. And then there's communities that are significantly at risk. Here, where we are in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, we have the southern resident pod of orcas who are significantly endangered. And when we're talking about endangered, so we know there are 74 individuals in that pod. When we're talking about vaquitas who are down in northern Mexico, we're talking about 10 individuals left. And so we're talking about very, very significant numbers. When we're talking about Chinese paddlefish, some of them haven't been seen in 10 years, so they could already be extinct. We're not really sure. And as Amy suggested, we're not great at numbers, right? So we're not in the spaces where these animals are all the time. We don't know as much as we should about their migratory paths and patterns. So we literally don't know if we've already lost some of these species, and some of them are so few in individual numbers that it's hard to imagine we're going to be able to save them.
Yeah, that's absolutely shocking. And you kind of spoke about these species that people may not even consider as animals. Kind of going on from that, what behaviours do aquatic animals possess, do you think, that people might not be aware of?
Lots and lots of behaviors. And the nice thing is there's an awful lot of science that's come out over the last 10, 15, 20 years, where scientists too, I think, were ignoring aquatic species because, again, they're really hard to study. You either have to be in their environment, in the water environment, for a long period of time to see what they're doing, or you have to take them out of that environment. You have to know they're there in the first place to study, take them out of that environment, put in a very unnatural and hard to maintain environment in a laboratory, for instance, and study them there. So I think it's taken a long time for scientists to really begin to focus on aquatic species, but there has been a significant engagement over the last couple of decades, and that has yielded a lot of really useful science. So the main question that people ask are, can they feel? Because that's sort of the baseline philosophically and even sometimes legally about whether we care about a species. And it makes sense, because if they don't feel, then if you hit them, for instance, they don't feel pain, then it doesn't matter morally, legally, ethically if you hit them, because you're not causing harm, theoretically. And so the answer to that question is yes, they are sentient. And so we have a consensus finally in the scientific community that finfish feel pain. And we have seen enough studies, and I'll talk about some of the other capacities that animals have been shown to have. But we've reached the conclusion that we should default to the understanding or the belief that all animals, tested or untested, are sentient, because it doesn't make sense biologically for a being not to have some protective mechanism from harm. And so we think we should be kind of flipping the default assumption and just let's assume they all can feel, because we have enough scientific data for most of them. Now, what we have is sort of spotty science for different species. So we'll have some on octopus, we'll have some on, finfish, so it's all over the place, but the capacities are phenomenal, right? So that they're conscious, they're self-aware, they understand the difference between themselves and other animals in their group or across species, that they can cooperate across species. They have the capacity to be aware of time, that they have good memories, they can recognize human faces. And that one in particular is useful for people to think about, because a lot of folks say, well, whatever capacities they have are instinctual, they're just necessary for species survival. Well, species survival has nothing to do with interaction with humans. So the fact that they can recognize, distinguish, and remember different human faces, I think, is a real good answer to that kind of response. They have cognitive capacities. They have emotional, psychological capacities, complex cognition. They can engage in deception, in manipulation, in tool use, in social learning. They have so many capacities, basically all kinds of things that we attribute only to ourselves as a human species. And so there are a couple of examples of tests that have come out over the last few years that, again, exhibit or prove these kinds of things. So there's something called the mirror test that helps prove self-awareness, that an animal can recognize him or herself in a mirror as him or herself. And even children, sometimes up to 2 years old, can't pass this test. They think it's another child in the mirror. And so manta rays and cleaner wrasse fish have passed those tests, even to the point where some scientists are saying, well, maybe the test isn't any good anymore, because if these animals can pass it, which is ridiculous. We also know that cuttlefish have passed what's called the Stanford marshmallow test. And this is a test of patience and strategic decision-making about actions in one's own benefit. So you could get a marshmallow right now, or you're told if you can wait a few minutes, you can get 2 marshmallows. And again, some children don't pass this test. Some adults don't think we pass this test. But cuttlefish have passed this test. And so think about the highly sophisticated level of communication that has to happen between the researcher and the animal to communicate what the parameters even of this test are, much less for the animal to engage in the test and then successfully achieve the objectives. So I think we have a lot of science now showing these phenomenal capacities. The other thing that I want to say when we talk about capacity, sometimes we spend time trying to educate people about these capacities, and I forget to say, so I'm not going to forget this time, to say that this is based on the idea that the more that these animals are like us, the more we should value them. And there's some benefit to that kind of approach to this conversation. But we also want to posit another approach, which is they don't have to be like us to be protected. And they actually have, when you look at them for their own sake, amazing capacities that we don't have. They have the capacity to regenerate limbs or change color or shape, to create their own homes and repair them. They can hear differently, see differently, taste differently. They can communicate over vast differences. They can create their own light, and they can survive in these incredibly hostile environments. So they have these amazing capacities that should be valued for their own sake. And so while it's important to look at the capacities, it shouldn't be the only measure of how we value these animals. But it's useful to look at them. It's amazing to see what we're finding. And we should be thrilled to learn more about the capacities that they have beyond our own sort of limited sensory capacities.
Amazing. Thanks so much. That's so interesting. And yeah, as you say, I'm just so glad the science is growing in this area. And yeah, just kind of appreciating them, as you say, in their own right and the individual kind of species that they are. So yeah, I think it's incredible. And a lot of our supporters are really interested in learning more on this topic. So Amy, what steps can people take to further help to protect aquatic animals?
That's a great question. I think people tend to think that it's very difficult, or that you might have to be a professional or even a lawyer to advocate for aquatic animals, and this is simply not true. You can literally not do anything, but rather stop doing things that can have a major and huge impact. So one thing is to not eat aquatic animals or their products, or to eat less of them. You might even try some of the widely available seafood substitutes if you're able to do so. As Kathy mentioned, there's a growing number of them and they're very delicious. You might even, stop supporting these industries or doing activities that are harmful to aquatic animals. So you can stop going to places like SeaWorld and aquariums where they keep them in captivity, which is extremely cruel. And then considering how you impact on their habitats is another big step that you can do. So things like recycling, using less plastic, and even other harmful materials and chemicals that can ultimately end up in waterways, which obviously impacts on them. Then, of course, you can actively support organizations that are doing work to protect these animals and their habitats. For example, Animal Equality, you can sign petitions, write letters to your government or representatives. So there's a lot of active steps that you can take. But I would say one big thing that you should try and do is to consistently educate yourself about how you are impacting on these animals and their activities with your day-to-day habits. and then try and educate others around you when you find out about it and share this information with them. And I really believe that absolutely everyone can make a difference. So you just need to find out how to do this.
Amazing. Yeah, completely agree. Just so much we can all be doing. Just looking into the issues is just the first step, isn't it? And Kathy, how can people get involved with or start a career in animal law?
Is also a great question. I think that it's useful for people to think about whether a legal career is what they want to do. So we see a lot of students who come and ask questions about coming to law school to help animals. And so one of the first elements of that conversation that I tend to have with folks is, what is it that you're trying to do? And what are your sort of tolerances? How patient are you? How much are you in it sort of for the long haul? And basically, are you interested in structural change or immediate change? So for people who want to go literally save animals, they can do the things that Amy's talking about. There's a whole bunch of other things. So if you really want to go work with animals, then being an animal lawyer, you need to understand that's a little bit separate. And you need to understand that you'll be going to law school here in the United States. That would be 4 years of college, 3 years of law school before you can start a career. It doesn't mean you can't do things while you're in school, but that's going to take some time. And legal change takes a lot of time. So we talked about the challenges, we talked about the holes in legislative, and we haven't even talked about what it looks like in the court side, right? So there's so many problems within those systemic structures all by themselves that you have to navigate. So you have to have the patience and the desire to navigate those systems. But if your goal is systemic change, this is a great way for you to think about doing that, because once you get a law in place, you can affect millions and millions of animals with one stroke of the pen, so to speak. So I suggest that people begin to explore whether law school is something that they want to do, whether being a lawyer. And the nice thing is that today being a lawyer means all kinds of things. It's not just going into a courtroom. It's not just speaking before a legislature. It's all kinds of things. So I suggest that people to start looking at what is out there. They can audit some law school courses. They can talk with current law students and professors. You can talk with organizations you're interested in working with and see what they need. Some of them may say, we need lawyers for these reasons, for these tasks. And if that's what you want to do, then that may be a really good path. You can attend some events, some webinars. We have what are called CLEs, continuing legal education. You can begin reading about these things and see if legal reading and that legal environment is something you're interested in. There are local groups who have affiliations with lawyers. You can start to ask about that aspect of the work and see if you can learn more and see if that's what you're interested in. So there's lots of things that you can think about. And then in the engagements that Amy suggested, you can also be thinking about the legal aspects of that, right? So if you can ask questions at the grocery store or restaurants that you inhabit, right? Or thinking about changes in your places of work, where you shop, where you study, where you pray, where you go for entertainment, see the animals, and then ask yourself, if not the people there, what are sort of the legal constraints for how animals are treated in that environment? And so just beginning to add that component to your conversation and your inquiry will let you know whether this is a path you really want to be on. And once you're on it, I'll say that you can reach out to people like me and to Amy. There are people all over the world. The folks we know who are engaged in animal law are more than happy to help get more people on this journey with us. So we're happy. You can just reach out for more information.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you. It's absolutely amazing answers. I've learned so much today, and I'm sure our supporters have as well. And that brings us to the end of our questions. So again, just a huge thank you for your time today and for giving us a real insight into your work. And on behalf of Animal Equality and all our supporters, I'd like to say a huge thank you for your dedication to improving legal protections for aquatic animals, and in turn helping to create more empathy and compassion towards these fantastic animals. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us. We've had a lovely time talking with you.